Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for letting me come this morning. I'm excited about the opportunity to speak to you all. Just again, a rehash. Yes, when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a grandfather, I'm a coach, and I help people make decisions on end of life when they're facing those decisions. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about advanced care planning. I have copies of my presentation in the back. If you'd like to take them when you leave or after the break, feel free to grab them, and we'll go from here. And I think, okay, is this the right one? Middle one?
Middle one should do it.
Okay. So these are the objectives of our call or our presentation today. What is an advance directive? How to get started? Who can be a patient advocate? How do I make my Michigan patient advocate designation legal? What if I change my mind? Have you filled out your healthcare directive? Now what? Roles of the professional and resources. So here's the elephant in the room. Culturally here in the United States, most of us don't want to talk about death. It's the can we continue to kick down the road. I would imagine if I was to survey or talk to you on a one-to-one basis, most of you have had a personal experience either with a parent, with a loved one, or you know somebody that when it comes to this topic about death, it's a very difficult one, and they just continue to push it down the road. So what we want to do is try to demyth some of the concepts of death. Our chief medical director, Dr. Paletta, tells a story that he goes into, will teach medical students at Wayne State. And he often asks, he says, okay, how many here students, how many of you think your patients aren't going to die? You know, and hands go up. And he goes, all right, maybe let me repeat the question more slowly. How many people here think that patients won't die? And the fact is, we all are going to die. It's the circle of life. And so as an individual, we have as an opportunity to prepare how we want our end of life to take place. So what is an advanced care directive? The key points here is it's a legal document, it's in writing, and it expresses what your wishes are when it comes to end of life. I don't know, there's been situations where people will have an emergency that takes place. I've had it in my own life, and I'm sure some of you have had it in your own life, where life is going around fine. You know, you're 50 years old, you're 60 years old, everything seems to be great. Maybe you've just retired, and life is doing well, and all of a sudden, you come to a stop sign, you look both ways, you pull out, and all of a sudden, out of no place, a car comes out of no place, T-bones you, and that person in the car can no longer speak for themselves. They're in a state of coma. And the family is then forced to say, well, geez, I don't know what Dave's wishes were. And they turn to the doctors, and the doctors rapidly will say, well, here's the situation, here's the options that would take place. And it can be overwhelming for any individual to say, well, again, what was Dave's wishes? I don't know, we never talked about this. So again, what we're encouraging here is people to sit down and start talking about what their wishes are. Hopefully it won't be T-boat accident, but again, things do happen that we may not expect. So how do we get started? Think and reflect, talk about it, write it down. Talk about it. 92% say it's important, but only 32% actually have the conversation. So, a little survey here. Show of hands, how many people have actually had a conversation with your spouse, significant other, or loved ones about what your wishes are? Oh, good, good. That's good. I like that. Good. Now, put those hands up, please. Please put those hands up. How many have it in writing? Oh, very good. Very good. Okay, we won't point out the people who haven't had the conversation and don't have it in writing yet. So hopefully this will spur you on this morning. So here's some conversation points that you might want to talk about. And I'm going to share a story, a personal story. This is about 12 years ago. My mom died, and she had been married to my dad for 52 years. And within 4 months later, my dad was diagnosed with heart problems, and the doctor said, Ken, it's time for open heart surgery. That's your option. And if I knew then what I know now, I think my brother and I would have asked some more questions of my dad, who was 78 or 80 years old. Did we ask the questions? Well, okay, at 88 years old, what's the prognosis for open heart surgery? What's the recovery time? What is that experience going to be like? Dad, is there something on your bucket list that you have not been able to do, that you'd like to do as opposed to open heart surgery? We didn't ask those questions. My dad was of that generation, well, if that's what the doctor says, I think that's what I want to do. And the doctor performed, the surgery was a success. Unfortunately, 6 weeks later, my dad passed away. Now, it wasn't, 88 years old. It could have been, he said, I've missed my wife, Rita. I want to just be with her. But again, from a personal perspective, we never asked Dad what his wishes were. We never sat down and had that conversation. So, point again, clearly state your preferences for end-of-life medical treatment and engage those both professionally, the doctors, as well as your family. Put it in writing. So where do you stand? You got the thing up, the little banner up there in terms of value. Everybody has what their wishes are, what their values are, what they stand for. And it's important for you to sit down and share that with your loved ones and with your doctors. What is the doctor's role? What is the loved one's role? What is your advocate's role? And so again, from those hands that went up, my question is, you've had the conversation. Would anybody like to kind of share a story of how that conversation got started and who it was with? Anybody? Thank you.
To begin with, I had a conversation with my daughter, who has decided that I'm never going to die because she won't allow it. So that's usually the first hurdle, because everyone is in denial. They don't want to lose me because they've gotten used to calling me for everything. But I did sit down and attempt to go over a lot of the information. I sat down with them and told them where I put it in my file cabinet, what it's labeled under. I'm in process now of actually, I have one of those books that says things people need to know when you die. And I started actually putting the information in the book to try to further assist them. My daughter is going to fall apart. My girlfriend just told me, she said, you can't leave anything for her. She'll be in the hospital inside a straitjacket. My grandkids will be trying to do the best they can, because I know that they're not going to be able to do anything. And my sister won't understand anything that's in there, but, and that's for everyone in the room, what you have to decide is, you've made the information available. You don't care because you're dead. And I actually had to just get to that point. I'm going to try to put as much information out there. But once I'm dead, do I care what they do with the money? No. Do I care how they handle the finances? No. Do I care how they sell or don't sell the house? No. So that's my experience with my relatives on how and what to do at the time. The one thing that I have not yet completely finished, which my mother did before she died, and that is she actually wrote out her, what's it called, for your funeral? Eulogy. My mother actually wrote out her eulogy, and I'm in the process of writing that out because I've had to assist friends of mine's family in doing that, and you'd be surprised how many loved ones you have that are very close to you that really are not aware of what you've done in your life, the things that you may or may not have received, you know, just very simple things. Where you went to elementary school. I don't think my daughter even knows that. So a lot of times just writing those out in some sort of fashion will help even that document to be prepared. Thank you. I know I
Thank you.
talk a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A nice, yes.
Down with my father, who's since passed, and I said, "You were married to my mother for 35 years. You're married to her sister, which is common in our culture, after my mother died, for 28 years. With whom do you want to be buried?" And that started a whole afternoon. He sat down with me and he said, "I am so thankful you have brought it up because I wanted to talk to you for I don't know how long about this, and I didn't know how to open the subject." And so we had a delightful, very warm conversation about it. The second thing, I told my family member who is going to, in our will, "When you die, this is where I want the money to go." And she sat right down next to me and she said, "I'm not going to give the money to them." And I said, "Okay, we'll rethink this whole thing and you may not be getting the money either." So just two things to even think about.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you both. This is a next segue into the next slide. Oop. There we go. Oop. So, who's the patient advocate? Have to be 18 or older, someone you trust, accepts the role in writing, and perhaps the most important thing is to be assertive. Someone who is going to be in the face of people who might say, we need to do this, we might need to do that, and to be able to say, no, Dave, these were his wishes, and this is what we want to do. We also encourage go through a dry run with that advocate and have a sit down and have that conversation. You mentioned, I'm sorry, your name right here. Your name? Your name? Your name. So you mentioned that it was challenging having that conversation with your loved ones, and each one of them had their own sense of what their responsibility was going to be. And that could be a very difficult challenge to overcome. You got to find that advocate who kind of pushes their self to the side and says, no, I'm going to be that advocate for Dave, for John, for Mary, for whomever, because we've sat down, we've talked about it, and I'm willing to accept the responsibility to do what that person asked me to do. Another important thing is when you are an advocate, we all have our cell phones now. People don't have the long lines anymore. If that phone rings at 2 o'clock in the morning and it's a number that you're not familiar with, you got to pick it up because it might be the emergency room who's calling and says, John's here in the emergency room. You're listed as the patient advocate. You need to pick that phone up. How often do we get those phone? Somebody's soliciting us. I don't recognize the number. I'm having dinner. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. Who's calling me? Ignore it. So an advocate has to be willing to take on that responsibility as well. The advocate plays such a critical role, and that advocate could change over time as well. But again, these are the important points in terms of who your patient advocate can be. When we talk about having a dry run, I know one of my coworkers shares the story about being in the hospital with a loved one, and she was the daughter, and she had a daughter-in-law or a sister-in-law with her, and they played good cop, bad cop. And so the bad cop, the sister-in-law, would go down and would get in the face of the staff of the hospital saying, we need this, we need this. You're not doing this, you're not doing that. Thank you very much for doing that. And so she would get in the face of the staff, and then the good cop would come in and go, I'm sorry, so-and-so is but she's just trying to do the best that she can. But they have, team up, but again, it's very important for that advocate to know what their role is. They're there to express and protect your wishes. So tips for being ineffective. We've kind of talked about this, but again, protecting and respecting the boundaries. Be the second best authority on a person's health. And what can often, when we ask the patient advocate to do, is to join that person that they're advocate for when they go to doctor's offices and appointments. Because sometimes what you hear is different from what you grasp. So it's often good to have two people there. Again, just a recent situation with my own wife and I, we had an emergency room situation, and the physician came in and explained the procedure that was going to be done. And after he left, I said to my wife, I said, Molly, I said, what did you hear? Because this is what I heard. And she says, no, this is what I heard. So it's good to have, again, that advocate to be with you when you go to doctor's appointments, to be able to jot down notes so that you can sit and talk afterwards. Okay, this is what I heard. And that advocate will also say, I really don't understand what you just said. Sometimes medical terms can be a little bit overwhelming. And so, time out, could you just explain again what that procedure or what that medicine is, what it's going to do? So it's very important for that advocate to be there and be a part of the conversations. Stand between the patient and the threats to their own control. Again, I talked about this a little bit, is having that advocate be able to put their mindset, what their wishes might be, what they think might be best in the situation, to put this to the side and say, no, I'm here an advocate for Dave. This is what I'm here for. As I say, don't ask questions, don't accept bad news, don't go it alone. Have a partner, have an advocate. So how do I make my Michigan patient advocate designation legal? This is kind of the legal mumbo jumbo. But again, these are the points that you have to be taken into consideration when you're having your patient advocate designation. Important thing about the witnesses. So it says here, the witnesses cannot be, and there's the list of who can't be your witnesses. This is important. If somebody's in an employee healthcare or mental health care facility where you're being treated, again, you can't go to the executive director or the unit nurse. They have them sign your advocate, your designation. You have to have somebody who's a neutral party. So again, these are the points to kind of be sensitive to in terms of who can not be your witness. And again, it may vary from state to state. For those who are visualizing this that might be out of state, you might want to check out with the local state authorities in terms of what is required. You can always change your mind. And if you change your mind, you have to talk to the advocate who may no longer be an advocate. Let's say it's your daughter and she's been your advocate for the last 5 years, and all of a sudden her husband has an opportunity and a job takes them to another state. So now, okay, do I want my advocate who's going to be in another state be available? And can that person be responsible and timely to be able to take care of me if a situation comes up? So it's certainly, within your right to be able to change that advocate if circumstances change. And a couple of points about your will automatically be revoked. Again, some key points there is about your spouse is your patient advocate, and theirs is an entry by a judge. Your patient advocate resigns his or her responsibilities. You die unless you've given the patient advocate authority to donate your organs on page 3 of the form. That again, the different forms could vary from different forms from one to the other. Oh, yes.
All right, you've given you picked your patient advocate.
Yes.
Then you become unable really to make those kinds of decisions, and then something happens where that patient advocate isn't really that well capable, can you have a second patient
Sure.
advocate designated that if that person is unable, then
Mhm.
it would go to a secondary person?
Yes, you
Or
can.
something?
You can. Yes, you can have multiple, here's number one, here's number two. Again, as long as it's in writing, so that, again, whoever may be taking care of you at the time can say, okay, John's not available, I'm going to go to Mary. So yes, as long as it's in writing. Okay, now what? You've got it all taken care of. And here's some key points to, yes. Does not have to be notarized. Okay. So here's some ideas about, you've got it taken care of. So where do you now put this document? And we suggest that you make multiple copies and keep them virtually every place that you think you can. Where would be a good spot? On these devices. Okay. You can have it on this device. Make a copy and keep it in your glove compartment if you're still driving. If you travel often out of state, out of town, out of country, put it in your luggage. The EMS folks now, most of them, if they come into your house because of an emergency, they call up, so-and-so's not breathing, please come here. When the ambulance comes, most of the EMS folks now are trained. They're conditioned to go to the freezer and open up the freezer and look for an advanced directive. We suggest that you take it, put it in one of those plastic bags that you can get at Walmart or Costco, and just put it in the freezer. And the EMS folks have told us, why do we put it in the freezer? Well, if in the event that there's a fire, everything else may burn around, but that refrigerator and that freezer, it's going to be safekeeping there. But again, most EMS folks now, when they go into an emergency or an emergency call, they're going to go and look for an advanced directive in the freezer. A lot of police or fire stations, they offer the file of life. Is anybody familiar with the file of life? It's a little red magnet. Put it right up there on the refrigerator or someplace where it's very visual. Again, put it on your phone. If you are the advocate and something happens to somebody and you're out of town or they're out of town, to be able to pull it up on your phone and say, okay, emergency room, give me an email, give me a fax number, boom, I can send it right to you what the wishes are for my mom, my dad, my cousin, whomever you're the advocate for. For people who are perhaps experiencing some form of dementia, but still living in their own home, we suggest building a control center. And that control center can have calendar with dates on it. It can have the pill box. It can have everything right there in one spot for both the family members as well as the patient. So it's right there. It's their control center, right next to, usually by the phone, next to the refrigerator. Another means of, again, sharing that information with people who might be coming in, might be taking care of you, who are your advocates. Any questions on where you might want to keep your advanced directive? Anybody want to volunteer where they keep theirs? To the hospital. Yep, yep. I know. Again, most recent experience when we were when we were going through the admission process at the emergency room, a gentleman came up and said, checking out dates, this, that, you're allergic to this, allergic to that. They said, okay, we don't have your advanced directive on file. Would you please send it to us? So we have a to-do to do. But I think that's common practice now when you get admitted, and most of them are going to say, do you have an advanced directive? Yes.
I would just like to add that when my husband, my sister, and I were all patient advocates for my mom, and in her later years, she was going in and out of the hospital off and on. And we did give, every time, he had like 6 or 7 copies of these advanced directives. And even within the same hospital visit where they would be having some rehab after a surgery, they would say, well, we don't have this. And you would have to pull it out again.
Yep.
He would even have to pull out a list of her meds again for sometimes in the, and this was Oakwood Hospital. This wasn't some small time thing. So it's always good to have, now they got the phones. Back then we weren't using them like the smartphones. But it's always good to have quite a few copies of something because
Yep.
they'll just say they don't have it even though you gave it to them 2 days earlier.
Mine was scanned it was at Beaumont, and they
Yep.
scanned it, so it's part of the electronic systems. No matter which unit you go to, they'll have it if they look.
Yep. Oh,
I think you
somebody's
bring up a
Notre
really
Dame
excellent
fan.
point, and I want to stress that since this is going out across the nation, Michigan is one of the states where every time you change care settings, they have to ask you again. It's not a permanent document, so if you're in a hospital and you go to inpatient rehab, it might look like you go down the hall, but it's actually a different unit as far as records and insurance and all of that is. So I think all of you make excellent points. There are some states that might have something called a MOLST or a POLST, just something like physician orders for life-sustaining treatment that is a more permanent document. But right now, Michigan, so I would say get to know your state, but whatever state you're in, the more copies, the better. But that's the reason. A lot of people get very frustrated, like, can I trust these people with my wishes if they keep asking me? But Michigan requires you with every change in care setting to ask again and redocument.
So for instance, my mother has a Michigan, an advanced directive created by an attorney here,
Yes.
but she spends a couple months with my brother in California.
Mhm.
They have, California flaky laws. So is the Michigan advanced directive legal there, or should she have a separate one for there?
My suggestion would be to have a separate one for California, or at least to check to see if what she has written down is acceptable there in the state of California. That would be my suggestion.
Okay.
That's a good question. Because we have a lot of people who, split, spend summertime up here in Michigan and then spend, they're snowbirds and spend other times down in Florida or Arizona. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Yo.
Somebody mentioned Oakwood Hospital. I changed doctors because I didn't like Oakwood Hospital. Again, now what in terms of the state here in Michigan, one of the points I wanted to bring out here is that your advanced directive does not play or is not applicable in a case of a medical emergency. And by that, I mean is medical emergency where you go in, you've fallen down, broken a bone, but you're still able to communicate back and forth. That would be a medical emergency where the advanced directive does not come into play. Or you're not in a coma. Again, you can still speak for yourself. So in that case where medical emergency, where your patient or your advanced directive is not applicable. Next up, the role of the professional. Ask, listen, advocate, and support. I think it's very important that as you have your advanced directive to sit down and talk with your doctor. Medicare now has a reimbursement for you to sit down and have an end-of-life conversation with your doctor. So it's reimbursable. I believe it's, Susan, what is it, 20 minutes, first 20 minutes of the conversation? Like 16. So again, it's a reimbursable appointment that you can schedule and set up and sit down and talk with your doctor and express to them what your wishes are so that they have a clear understanding of what you want. Share with them what your biggest fear is. I think it's very important, again, to have that relationship with a primary care doctor so that they truly have an understanding of where you're coming from. Define what quality of life is for you to them. I mean, the doctors have a very busy day. They're seeing lots of patients. And I think it's important for you to share with them what your advanced directives are set that meeting up, express it to them, ask them, did you hear what I said? Are there any questions on your part? So that they have an understanding, whether it be your primary care physician, or if something more serious happens with a specialist, an oncologist, a cardiologist, again, to sit down and have that conversation with them so that they have a clear understanding of what your wishes are. Yes, sir.
Question about this advanced directive. If you keep it around all over the house and your house is broken into and a document disappears, someone steals it, are you in trouble, liable, or what?
When you say, meaning you have the advanced directive.
Say you
for
got
s-
an advanced directive all over the house.
Yes.
House gets broken in, crooks, they steal this, they take the advanced directive with them. That's all your information they already have. Can they go someplace to jeopardize your identity or anything like that?
I'm not sure that there would be any legal ramifications if somebody stole. Again, I just want to make sure they stole your advanced directive or an advanced directive of somebody else. Yes. Yeah. Yep.
What happens with the information and advanced directive? Are you liable? Are they liable? Is it good put out to the public or what?
Well,
Repeat the question here. Microphone to come to you. People, the webinar is working, so is the microphone. So the people on the webinar can't hear the question unless you do wait for the microphone, please.
Okay. The question is, you have an advanced directive. Your house gets broken in by thieves. They steal your, say, TV, computer, whatever. They also steal your advanced directive. Are there any ramifications of them having your advanced directive? Are you liable for anything, or does that cause you identity problems?
I'll be truthful. I do not know the answer in terms of legal ramifications. I would say that again, the reason to have multiple copies with different people is helpful so that if yours is missing or stolen, that you have something to back it up with. But as far as a legal ramification about maybe people taking your personal information, I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that one. But thank you for asking. I'll find out. Okay. Another thing too, in terms of professional healthcare, I go way back to, and I may pick on somebody here in the audience who's volunteered to share a story. But if you have a loved one who is living or residing in a nursing home or an assisted living or an adult foster care home or perhaps one of these independent living communities, it's very important, they're professionals too. They're part of that health services ecosystem. They're part of that connection. So it's important for you to share with them what the wishes are. Again, in a personal example, my father-in-law was living in an assisted living. He had an advanced directive, and he was walking down to lunch, and he collapsed. He had a bleed, and the EMS folks came in, and they did not know that he had an advanced directive, and so they're obligated to try to revive him. They took him to the hospital, put him on life support systems, and it ended up my sister-in-law had to make that decision and say, well, Dad's wishes were no aggressive treatment or care for my dad, so they turned off the life support systems. But again, it's good to share with the folks who are managing the building that a loved one might be in so that they have a clear understanding of what the wishes are too. So we have lots of resources, and there are lots of free resources. The question was asked about getting it notarized. You don't have to get it notarized. You just have to have it witnessed by the two people who are not connected or not one of the ones listed who can't be your witnesses. But there's so much free information out there. I'm going to introduce Susan Kuhar. Susan, would you stand up? Susan is with Hospice of Michigan. She too is a certified advanced care planner through Respecting Choices. Hospice of Michigan has a handful of advisors who have gone through the certification process And as a community service, we are available to come out and sit down and talk with anybody who wants to start the process or has questions about putting an advanced directive into place. What you see up here is some links to some different resources that you can tap into. Again, we encourage people, you don't, outside of the will, as far as the advanced directive is concerned, there's a lot of free information out there that you can tap into and help you and with starting the conversation or making sure that you've answered all the questions correctly. And before I conclude, where's John? John Kaiser. John shared a story with me earlier this morning. John, would you just like to share your experience about your mom?
My mom, in 2000, I'm gonna go up front so you don't have to turn around. Dale, where, it doesn't matter where I'm standing, right? Okay, no, I meant as far as, my mom in 2015 was 95, aiming for 100. And she had a fair number of problems, and she had swallowing problems. She had done a pretty good job as far as being able to walk and get around. She was in an American House using their services. But she fell one more time and broke her hip. And went into the hospital, they repaired her hip. And then she was struggling with feeding, so they put in a feeding tube. And they told her at that time, they could not ever promise she'd get out of the, away from the feeding tube. And in my mind, she was headed for nursing, but I'm not sure she'd ever be walking again. So they questioned me. I said, well, let's do a do not resuscitate order. And they questioned me as to, well, why you put the feeding tube in? I said, well, I hadn't talked to her. And the point being that even though you may have information or advance decisions, at that moment, you got to go talk to the person. And I went to my mom and she says, I just want to go. And here we are over here whispering, trying to figure out how to keep her alive. And then of course the hospital, their duty is to, they're not concerned with what her life will be like. They're just concerned with keeping her alive, which is their duty. And, but she said she just wanted to go. So they brought in somebody for palliative care. And she says, no, I don't want palliative care. I want hospice. And you can't just go into hospice, but fortunately the doctor was able to write up such that she could go into hospice, and she passed 3 days later. And that wasn't even soon enough for her. Every day she'd say, how many more days do I have to keep this up? And she made it easier on the family by her making the decision. But my only point there would be make sure you, even though you might have advanced directives, make sure you talk to the person at that point in time. Is that kind of what you, okay.
You're sharing your story. In the back, we have some brochures and bags about advanced directive. There is copies of the presentation if you'd like to pick up one. Are there any questions before I turn it over to the next speaker? Yes, sir. Sure.
What agency in the state is responsible for the advanced directive?
What
What
agency?
agency? In other words, is there a specific, like you were saying, if you went to California, you had to find out whether this advanced directive is legal there?
Sure.
Who would you go to? I mean, if somebody comes to Michigan with an advanced directive, who would they go to determine whether it's legal or not?
I am going to turn to my colleague, Donna.
Hi, so I have a resource. AARP has some free things that are, you don't need to be a member, but there's guides to, most states have what they call like an ombudsman. So I have some generic, there are generic advanced directive forms. Sometimes they're provided by a hospital or a health system or something. But if you wanted to just, the state of Michigan, if you just Google state of Michigan advanced directive, it comes from a Michigan ombudsman, and it actually has a phone number on there. So I can get you that information specifically if you'd like it. But for people in other states, one of the resources in my slide packet is the 50 states of how to reach the people that handle that.
Got another one right here.
I have a question in reference to the patient advocate. When my father was at Veterans Hospital where he passed, there was a patient advocate at the hospital. He had his lawyer come in, draw up a last will and testament for him. When the patient advocate discovered that's what he was doing, she shredded the document. Did she have the right to do that? Just
Wow.
out of, she wasn't, now he didn't request she be the patient advocate. It's just that the hospital assigned her as the patient advocate for, I guess, the patients on that floor or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand, she was assigned as a patient advocate for your father.
No, she just said she was the patient advocate. I didn't even know she was a patient advocate. She was a hospital representative and her title was patient advocate,
Okay.
from my understanding.
And then the attorney was coming in to write the advance directive?
No, he came in because my dad, who felt he was never gonna die, had his last will and testament drawn up while he was in the hospital.
Huh.
She decided that she didn't feel that he was mentally capable of doing this document, and she shredded it.
I don't know what to respond to that. I mean, if your dad, he wasn't judged or medically declared incompetent, was he?
I didn't even go back to him to tell him that was done. I was so
Okay.
furious, I chose not to even fight it at that point. I just want to know, does the hospital's patient advocate have that kind of legal authority? That's what I'm trying to find out.
My understanding within the hospital setting, there's usually a social worker or a case manager assigned to patients, but
Yeah.
I've never heard of an assignment of somebody being an advocate in the terms of enforcing or speaking up to somebody, speaking on behalf of somebody for their advance directives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.